Good evening and welcome to the Kenmore Town of Tonawanda Union Free School District Board of Education meeting for our budget work session, for Tuesday, February 4th, 2020. District Clerk, please note that all trustees are present. Please rise for the pledge. Item 2 is the approval of the agenda. May I have a motion to approve? So moved by Andrew. Second by Matt. Any discussion? There being none, I call for a vote. All those in favor still signify with aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carried unanimously. Item number 3, budget development update by Mr. Picotto.
Before John gets started, again, we will be starting with a tough budget year, trying to be mindful of the taxpayers, stay within the tax cap, and yet we have a governor making proposals that the only net result of those proposals go unchallenged is to put more and more burden on the local taxpayer. So it's something numerous advocacy groups are going to be addressing, and with that, we'll turn it over to John.
Well, thank you for that cheerful introduction. I'll pick up the baton from there. So tonight we'll be reviewing our rollover budget for 2021. Just a quick recap of our timeline. We're at our first budget work session, really taking our first look at our finances as we roll forward our 1920 budget. Our next meeting for budget is on March 3rd. So here's a quick budget development status update. We took our first preliminary view at our healthcare budget for next year on January 6th. We are looking at the BOCES budget currently and working through that. We've also been analyzing the governor's state aid runs, which I'll get into in a little more depth on the next slide. We've been continuing with our reserves plan, specifically not balancing our budget, relying on our savings account. And there's going to be some pretty major changes budgetarily with the structure of how our 2021 budget is going to be put together. It's not necessarily adding funding, taking away funding, it's moving funding around, because essentially how our budget is built right now is that all of our payroll codes are under one location. They're all grouped together, but because of ESSA and New York State fiscal transparency, it's easy for us if we are to break those out into individual building codes, really taking all the teachers at, say, Holmes Elementary and putting them in a payroll code at Holmes Elementary so we can report a little easier to comply with ESSA and New York State fiscal transparency. We can do that right now. It just takes a lot more effort to kind of cross-reference the payroll codes and where they are in the buildings. We also issued a request for proposals for a healthcare consultant. We currently have Premier Consulting. We've been with them since about 2008, so we've issued another RFP just to look at our budget numbers again with those services. And then, of course, continuing with our strategic plan implementation and reviewing those expenditures moving forward. So we'll take a quick recap of our capital expenditures. So for our debt service for next year, we're looking at a total of $10.3 million. Our 2020 capital project ban will likely have a $580,000 impact for next year, and that's to cover design fees, architectural fees as we move forward with the project, assuming it gets approved tomorrow night. We also have the option of a BOCES capital project prepayment. Erie One BOCES is looking to do a capital project they had presented to the board last year, and every component district has to take a proportionate share of that. We were given our debt schedule for that and have the option to prepay. Tonight, we're not exactly sure if we're going to do that or not based on two factors. One is available funding, and two is how this plays into the tax cap formula. The governor signed into law that BOCES capital projects is now an exclusion for the tax cap, but there's some questions on how that's actually going to file into how we calculate our tax cap. So tonight, when I go over the tax cap, that doesn't include any kind of BOCES capital project. We have an overall reduction from our current budget of $454,000 in debt service, and a lot of that is due to an energy performance contract that has been expired. In concurrently, our building aid is reduced. So as our debt is structured, the aid will fall off as soon as that actual expenditure falls off as well.
John, before you go away from this slide, can you just take a second to explain the bond anticipation note to Matt, because he's new and...
Sure. So when we look to borrow for a project, we have a bond anticipation note, and a regular bond. A ban is short-term financing. We're legally allowed to borrow bans for 5 years concurrently. So this is really just a cash flow mechanism so we can pay for these expenses up front, because we don't necessarily have $580,000 budgeted in our general fund to pay for architectural fees. So this is a short-term borrowing. Once the project is complete, we go to a long-term borrowing, a bond for 15 years. That's similar to what we did this past project. We did short-term financing while the work was happening, and then once the work was completed, we did a long-term borrowing. So the interest rates on bans are usually pretty low, and then bonds are a tad higher, but that's a long-term financing. So really, again, just a cash flow mechanism for us to pay for these services as the work gets started. So you'll see once the actual capital project gets underway, assuming it moves forward, we'll be doing bans, but in much larger amounts to pay for contractors to do the work and materials and things like that. So we'll first take a look at our rollover budget expenditures. We start with our current budget of a little over $167 million, and then we down the line go through all of the known increases based on the information that we have today. So the lion's share of our increases are due to contractual increases. We have health insurance and benefits at 8.52%. BOE services has been trending around 3%, but again, we're working through those numbers specifically right now, so this is just an estimate. TRS and ERS and other retirement benefits and contributions is trending at 9.05%. We have that $454,000 reduction of debt service that you saw on the previous slide, but remember that our aid is being reduced slightly as well. We have some other miscellaneous expenditure increases for a total rollover budget increase of $5.964 million. So that gives us an expenditure budget for next year of just over $173 million, or a 3.57% increase over the current 19-20 budget. Now I'm going to shift over to revenues. We'll first take a look at our tax cap. Here's the formula that we show each year, but we'll make it a little more consumable on this slide. So we start with our 1920 tax levy, and we factor in the tax-based growth factor, This isn't the CPI number. This is the actual growth in the town and the village that is put on top of our current levy. We factor in our base year pilots. The other major piece is letter H here. That's the growth factor, that CPI. That came in at 1.81%. And again, that's 2% or CPI, whichever is lower. There's a reduction in our 2021 pilots going from a little over $1 million to $859,000. And then we look at our total exclusions. The capital tax levy is the one that plays the biggest role in Kenton. So that's $1.5 million. And at the bottom line for our 2021 tax levy limit, we're looking at a $88 million tax cap, or 2.31% over what we currently have levied this current year. Now again, as I had mentioned a few slides before, this does not factor in any kind of BOCES capital project. We're still waiting on final word on how to calculate that in. It shouldn't have too much of an impact. Now we'll pivot over to state aid. So the governor came out with his proposal a few weeks ago. His executive budget proposes $826 million, an increase which averages out to about 3%. $504 million that is dedicated to foundation aid. However, this is the smallest aid increase that we've seen since 2013-14, which was at $550 million. One of the major pain points that came out of this executive proposal is similar to what he had proposed last year, is combining the 10 categorical aids. Those categorical aids are listed here. Those in bold are the ones that affect Kenton directly. So essentially, instead of having a separate aid category for BOCES, which has been around $3.5 million for us, software, library, textbook, and hardware as separate aid categories that are calculated separately, he wants to roll all of those into a foundation aid number. So there's a few areas of concern on top of those categorical aids. Building aid is one of them. One of the proposed changes that the governor has made in his executive budget is how building aid is calculated specific to maximum cost allowance. A maximum cost allowance really is your spending capacity at each individual building. And what has changed is that these cost allowances, as quoted, critical to the instruction program, the protection of health and safety, or other appropriate use of facilities. So we're not allowed to use these cost allowances for things other than what's listed in italices there. So really what this means for us with this upcoming project is artificial turf, because what we've been told is that artificial turf doesn't necessarily fall into these 3 different categories.
Not even PE? You couldn't do like PE classes in the...
You could make a case for it, but it's so gray right now. What we're hearing is that the biggest implication to what is being proposed here is artificial turf facilities, similar to what we're putting in at Kenmore East. Now, it's too early to say whether something like this will go through. I'd be hard pressed to see that, especially the categorical aids piece, because there's going to be a lot of opposition. Because New York State public schools are structured in such a way, and this is how we get our funding. So if they're going to change the funding mechanism, they need to fundamentally change how these schools receive the funding. So to cut off this kind of building aid, but not change how we get aid from the state and how we can apply for aid, they just don't match up. Transportation aid is another one. He's looking at capping this. The lesser of expenses in the base year or approved expenses in the year before the base year multiplied by what they're calling an inflation enrollment index. They define that as the inflation enrollment index is the greater of CPI or CPI plus 5-year public non-public enrollment index. So it's just really taking an aid category and making it much more complicated. And essentially what it's doing is almost keeping transportation aid increases flat, because you're taking a look back and basing that on enrollment. Enrollment isn't necessarily a fair indicator, because the cost of doing business and the cost of transporting students doesn't necessarily go down based on a dip in enrollment or flat enrollment, as we know, because we bus to over 100 schools in the area. So what we have on this side really is a breakout of the executive proposal on how it's proposed when you pick up the state aid runs and what this really is interpreted for Kenton. So the pieces that are highlighted really are areas that are, I wouldn't say misrepresented, because the categorical aids are baked into that. So the biggest piece is foundation aid. So if you were to just pick this up and didn't know what the executive proposal had, you would say, wow, Kenton is a 12.22% increase in foundation aid. Now, we'd love that, but the actual foundation aid increase, when you back out all of those categorical aids, really is only 0.78%. It's not 12.22. UPK remains unchanged. BOCES, however, doesn't exist on the current executive proposal state aid runs, but we were able to work with the Association of School Business Officials, and they pulled all this data from the state and provided it to the business officials around New York to show us really what those aid categories are. So in the actual proposal, when you back out BOCES from foundation aid, we're looking at a decrease of 1.88%. That's not too shocking to us. We've been relying a little less on BOCES services, therefore our BOCES aid would go down consequently for that. High costs and public excess costs remain unchanged in the executive proposal. However, hardware and technology, we're seeing a 3.18% increase if we were to break that out and keep it as is. We see a slight increase on software, library, and textbook. Transportation, this doesn't necessarily reflect that previous slide where the governor's looking to cap that. Charter school transitional aid, we're seeing a decrease of 12%. Building aid, again, not necessarily factoring those maximum cost allowance changes and how that would affect us. We're seeing a slight decrease. That's to be anticipated, though, because remember, our debt service is reducing a little bit, so is our associated building aid. So really, the bottom line, we're looking at a total aid increase of 0.59%. So that's just a number that we cannot operate on, and the state needs to pick up their share of funding schools. Now, we're not alone in this. You know, schools across the state are still under that 1314 is the smallest increase we've seen, and this is the next largest. So we're just not in a position where we're getting adequate funding. But you can see that on these highlighted categories, it is quite misleading if you're not privy to what the governor's done in terms of rolling in those aids into foundation aid. Here's a quick history of our foundation aid. This is the actual aid that we've received from the state, and the yellow line represents as if the foundation aid formula was run as it was originally intended. So when you take this cumulatively since 2008, we have been $148 million underfunded because the formula has not run as it was originally intended. If we do a quick state aid comparison, the larger light blue bar is state aid without building aid, and then the smaller darker blue bar is with building aid. So that total that you see year to year is the total aid that we've received. You can see it started increasing around 2011-12, and it's starting to plateau a little bit in the most recent years. So when we take a look at our revenues, we do the same thing. We take our 2019-20 budget. We assume that we're going right to the cap at that 2.31%. We're looking to reduce our debt service reserve in conjunction with our obligation, so that's a $250,000 decrease. We're also looking to taper down our employee benefits reserve. That's something that we've been doing for the past 5 years and relying less and less on that, so that's a $100,000 decrease. We've been doing that year to year, as you've probably seen in the long-range financial plan. Our pilots are decreasing by 0.71%. Sales tax has been trending pretty strong, so we're looking to increase that $150,000. We have some other miscellaneous revenues with rentals and interest that equates to about $113,000. We're looking at a $200,000 total increase state aid. I know that we looked at 0.59% on the previous slide, but when we look at our public and private excess cost numbers, we have to do kind of our own calculations based on enrollment, because those never match up with the governor's proposal. So that net increase really is a 0.36% increase for next year, which equates to a $1.9 million increase. Now, if you were doing your math on the previous slide, you'll see that our expenditures are outpacing our revenues for next year by about $4 million. So just at our rollover budget, we're looking at a $4 million gap that we need to grapple with moving into next year. So where do we go from here? So as it was last year, our priority this year is to close that gap. There's a few ways to do that. That's increased revenues or reduced expenditures or a combination of both. A big piece for us this year is state aid advocacy. The governor has thrown a few curveballs at us, but one of the more concerning parts, as opposed to last year, is that the governor came out not only with some modifications to how state aid would come to school districts, but also propose additional legislation. So there was a lot more in the executive budget last year than there was this year. So it seems as if the focus is going to be much more on state aid funding, and that it's hard to know if that's going to be a good or a bad thing at this point. We need to continuously monitor our healthcare budget. We have another meeting coming up next week. Contract negotiations with the KTSEA are currently underway, and we have the substitute teachers contract expiring at the end of this fiscal year. We're anticipating a larger than normal teacher retirement due to the new incentive, and all notifications are due to the district no later than March 1st. As we do every year, we continue to review our staffing, and we're always monitoring our fund balance. My team starts looking at that in January. And then again, circling back to strategic planning funding for the following year. And that's it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do you have questions? Go ahead. Yep.
John, could you summarize for me, maybe for us, what exactly we should be advocating in the next month or so before the state budget is finalized in terms of putting separate aid sources or things in separate categories?
Sure.
Like BOCEs and what else?
Let me go back to that slide and I'll show you. Okay. There we go. So this is the big piece with the state aid foundation aid encompassing all of those 10 categorical aids. So these aid categories that you see here operate independent of foundation aid. So charter school transition aid is something that we don't rely too heavily on as a funding source because the formula varies so much. But the big ones for us are those other 5 that are bolded: the BOE, software, library, textbook, and hardware.
Okay.
The BOCES aid probably, well, not probably, it is the biggest piece of those. It's about $3 to $3.5 million that we've been receiving, because how it works is that when we purchase services through BOCES, we get a certain percentage of that back. I believe our BOCES aid number is around 64%. So we get 63 to 4% on the dollar back the following year, just for simple math. So if that's rolled into foundation aid, this is an opportunity potentially for the governor to kind of strike out how these formulas run independently and then roll everything into foundation aid. So foundation aid hasn't really been keeping pace with any school district's needs in New York State. So if you're going to take these 10 categorical aids that have been, I guess, keeping pace a little better than foundation aid and roll those into foundation aid, it's hard to say what that means for us moving forward, but you know, if I were a betting man, it's probably not so good if everything's lumped into foundation aid, because that's easier for the governor to kind of focus on that, and he's shown that he's been carving things out, like community school set aside is just one example. So who's to say that there's not other carve-outs of foundation aid in the future? Foundation aid was originally intended to be a non-categorical aid that's given to school districts to do with what we see fit. So he's starting to dip into that and carve out little pieces of, you know, this aid that we're otherwise should be using for how we see fit.
Okay, thanks. And you anticipated my other question for the most part when you touched on the deadline for notification for retirement, and that you are expecting, because of the incentive, a larger number than usual?
We are. So we're hoping with that, you know, that'll help close our budget gap or get us closer to closing that budget gap. It's hard to say really how many retirees at this point, just because it's so early in the process. We've received a few official notifications thus far, but I think we've been averaging around 12 to 15 a year. We're hoping to see maybe uppers in the mid-20s to 30.
Okay. And having attended that teaching crisis summit right here about a year ago, where I think there's the prediction that about a third of the teacher workforce around the state will be eligible for retirement in the next, I guess, 4 years now. Does that mean, do you think that over the next 4 years, that increase in our retirements will be sustained with or without incentive?
We looked at the total eligible over the next 5 years, and we have a pretty substantial number, but we feel that the timing is working in our favor now because of we're able to kind of get ahead of the curve before we see these mass retirements. Hopefully we can get those teachers hired here before all districts in the area are looking to hire at the same time. So in theory, that's how we're thinking it'll play out, but you know, until those out years happen, we're not really sure yet.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I have a couple. Our BOCES capital costs, was that like 800,000, 8 something?
The initial cost was about $860, I believe.
And we have to pay that all in 1 year, or is that spread out over time?
The total cost is, I think it's a little over $1.5 million, but that's over 5 years.
5 years,
Yeah.
okay. Those payroll codes you talked about breaking down for the transparency reports. What about traveling teachers? We are able to split up, like if we are sharing teachers between buildings?
So we would do that typically on an FTE basis. So
Okay.
if we know that, you know, 0.7 is going to be at building A and 0.3 is going to be at building B, we can break those out
Okay.
accordingly.
All right. And I don't know if you saw some of the proposed legislation for transportation. I don't know if ASBO's talking about this, based on ridership. So they're actually looking at how many kids use the buses, not what are supposed to be part of the route.
I
Which
did
would
not see that,
obviously
yeah.
complicate things even worse than what you were talking
Right.
about. So just, I'll have to take a look at those, pull those up. And the last question is, the governor's proposed cuts to Medicaid. Will they affect us at all with any sort of our special ed population or?
Our total Medicaid revenue is about $100,000 to $120,000.
Oh, okay.
So it's, in a $168 million budget, it's not that much, but, at this point, anytime we're facing a gap, every penny counts. So we're not really sure how that will directly affect us as a school district, but, it remains to be seen.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, thanks very much, John.
Thank you.
Hey, public, do you have any comments? I guess not. And we already skipped ahead and did our board comments. I just want to tell the board I'll be sending out information about our self-evaluation in the next week or so, so just keep an eye out for that. But if there's any other board comments? And we do not need an executive session tonight, so a motion to adjourn. So moved by Tom, second. By Andrew. Any discussion? All those in favor so signify with aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.